He had bought companies with less thought than he gave to ordering ribs, but when her fingers brushed his as she slipped him that note, something in her knowing eyes made his billion-dollar world suddenly feel like a house of cards. The rain drummed against the windows of Ruby's Roadhouse like impatient fingers, each drop catching the neon beer signs and scattering fractured light across worn vinyl booths. Daniel Cross adjusted his baseball cap lower and studied the laminated menu as if it contained merger documents instead of comfort food. 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of diners, truck stops, and conversations that didn't begin with "Yes, Mr. Cross" or end with quarterly projections.
Hello, if you're ready to hear the whole story, click subscribe and tap the notification bell. Type in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as touching as this one, or maybe even crazier. And you don't want to miss it. Now let's begin.
His reflection in the rain-streaked window showed a stranger. Stubble he'd never been allowed to keep, a flannel shirt that had never seen the inside of a dry cleaner, and eyes that looked almost normal. Not the calculating steel that stared back from boardroom mirrors, but something softer. More human, maybe. "More coffee, hon?" The voice belonged to a woman maybe 35, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and laugh lines that spoke of genuine smiles rather than corporate pleasantries. Her name tag read Mia in cheerful red letters, and she moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd been dancing between tables for years. "Please." Daniel's voice carried none of its usual authority. Here, he was just another customer trying to escape the storm. She filled his cup with the kind of attention that came from caring about small things. Not spilling, making sure he had enough cream, actually seeing him as a person rather than a bank account. When was the last time someone had looked at him like that? Really looked, not through him or around him, to what he could provide. "First time at Ruby's?" Mia asked, wiping down the adjacent table with practiced motions. "Yeah, heard you have good ribs. Best in 3 counties. Her smile held pride, the kind that came from being part of something that mattered, even if it was small. Though fair warning, Ruby doesn't believe in small portions. "Hope you're hungry." Daniel found himself smiling back, a real smile that felt foreign on his face. "I think I can manage." As Mia moved to her next table, Daniel watched her greet an elderly man with genuine warmth, asking about his grandchildren by name, remembering that he liked his eggs over easy and his bacon crispy. She knew these people. They knew her. It was the kind of connection that existed in a world Daniel had forgotten, or maybe never known. Across town, in a 1-bedroom apartment where the heater worked sporadically and the rent was 2 weeks overdue, Mia had started her day the same way she'd started every day for the past 18 months. Staring at a photograph. The frame was cheap plastic, the kind you picked up at the grocery store, but the image it held was priceless. A little girl with Mia's eyes and her father's chin, wearing a birthday crown made of construction paper and beaming like she'd discovered the secret to happiness. Emma would have been 8 now. Would have been starting 2nd grade, losing teeth, asking impossible questions about why the sky was blue and whether angels had birthdays. Mia pressed her fingertips to the glass, a morning ritual that hurt and helped in equal measure. "Morning, baby girl," she whispered. "Mama's gotta go make some tips today, okay? Rent won't pay itself." The accident had been 2 years ago. A drunk driver, a moment of impact, and suddenly the future she'd been building. Single mom making it work, putting herself through nursing school, dreaming of a little house with a yard where Emma could have a dog, all of it gone in an instant. She'd tried to go back to school afterward, but the words wouldn't stick. Nothing stuck. The only thing that helped was staying busy, staying useful, taking care of other people, because she couldn't take care of the one person who mattered most. Ruby's became her sanctuary. The rhythm of service, the simple transactions of coffee and comfort food, the way she could disappear into other people's needs and forget, for minutes at a time, the Emma-shaped hole in her world. But lately, she'd been noticing things, watching people. Really watching. Like the man in booth 7 who'd been coming in for 3 weeks now, always alone, always paying cash. Something about him didn't fit. His hands were too soft for the flannel shirt he wore, And when he thought no one was looking, his posture changed, straightened into something that spoke of power and control. He left tips that were exactly 20%, calculated to the penny, not the rough estimates of someone used to working for wages. Yesterday, she'd seen him get out of a battered pickup truck that was clearly a rental, the kind of vehicle someone chose when they wanted to blend in rather than stand out. And when his phone had rung during lunch, the voice that answered was different. Clipped, authoritative, nothing like the easy drawl he used with her. Mia had developed instincts about people. 2 years of grief had stripped away her tolerance for pretense, left her raw but perceptive. She could spot pain at 50 paces, recognize the careful masks people wore to navigate the world. And this man, whoever he really was wearing the most elaborate mask she'd ever seen. The question was why? What do you think Mia suspects about the mysterious customer? Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever had a feeling someone wasn't who they seemed to be. Standing in her tiny kitchen, heating leftover coffee in the microwave because the coffee maker had given up last month, Mia made a decision. Tonight, if he came in again, she was going to find out who Booth 7 really was. Not because she was nosy, but because something in his eyes reminded her of her own reflection in those first months after Emma died. Lost, isolated, desperately trying to be someone else because being yourself hurt too much. And maybe, just maybe, if she could help him find his way back to whoever he really was, it might help her remember who she used to be too. Daniel had been coming to Ruby's for exactly 21 days when everything changed. It started like any other evening. The same booth, the same careful anonymity, the same internal debate about whether the barbecue ribs were worth the risk of being recognized. He'd chosen this place precisely because it was forgettable, a roadside diner where billion-dollar CEOs didn't eat, where his face wouldn't trigger the inevitable recognition that came with being featured on magazine covers. The usual, Mia appeared at his table with that same genuine smile, but tonight something was different in her eyes. A sharpness, an awareness that made his chest tighten. Yeah, that'd be great. She poured his coffee with steady hands, but Daniel caught the slight pause, the way her gaze lingered on his face. Ribs, extra sauce, side of coleslaw, cornbread. You've got a good memory. Part of the job. Her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Though some customers are more memorable than others. The words landed like a gentle punch to his solar plexus. Daniel forced himself to maintain eye contact to keep his expression neutral, but inside alarms were screaming. She knew. Somehow, this waitress in a roadside diner had seen through 3 weeks of careful deception. Mia moved away to place his order, but Daniel could feel her watching him, even when she was across the room serving other tables. The easy anonymity he'd been hiding behind suddenly felt paper-thin. 20 minutes later, she returned with his food, the same heaping plate of ribs that had become his temporary escape from the world of hostile takeovers and board meetings. But tonight, tucked under the edge of his plate, was something that didn't belong. A folded napkin. "Enjoy," Mia said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that made his throat constrict. Daniel waited until she'd moved away before lifting the corner of his plate. The napkin was small, ordinary white paper, but his hands trembled as he unfolded it. Inside, written in careful handwriting, were words that stopped his world. "I know who you are. But more importantly, I know who you're trying to be. The question is, who do you want to become?" The restaurant sounds, clinking silverware, a staff muted conversations, the hiss of the grill, faded to white noise. Daniel's vision tunneled until nothing existed except those words, written by a woman who should have been a stranger, but had somehow seen straight through to the core of him. He looked up to find Mia across the room, refilling coffee for an elderly couple. She didn't look back, didn't give any sign that she'd just detonated a bomb in his carefully constructed facade. But her shoulders were tense, and he could see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing even from across the room. "I know who you are." Daniel Cross, CEO of Cross Industries. Net worth that fluctuated between 2.8 and 3.2 billion, depending on market conditions. Man who owned 17 homes he'd never slept in and could buy this entire restaurant without checking his account balance. But that wasn't what the note meant, was it? She knew about the other Daniel Cross. The one who'd been running for 3 weeks, hiding in diners and truck stops, desperate to remember what it felt like to be human. The man who'd built an empire but couldn't build a single meaningful relationship, who had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. His phone buzzed. Marcus from the legal department, probably with updates on the Henderson merger. Daniel stared at the screen, then slowly turned the phone face down. For the first time in 15 years, the business could wait. Across the room, Mia was struggling to maintain her composure. Writing that note had been the boldest thing she'd done since Emma died, but seeing his reaction, the way all color had drained from his face, the way his hands had started shaking, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd spent the last week researching him. One grainy photo from a business magazine had been enough to confirm what her instincts had been screaming. Daniel Cross, the corporate shark who'd made headlines for his ruthless efficiency and complete lack of social presence. The man who gave anonymous donations to children's hospitals but never attended the galas. Who'd built a fortune but had no family, no friends, no one who'd notice if he disappeared for 3 weeks. What had driven a billionaire to eat ribs in a roadside diner, night after night, pretending to be someone he wasn't? Mia approached his table with fresh coffee, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was either the stupidest thing she'd ever done, or the most important. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Daniel looked up, and she saw something in his eyes that made her chest ache with recognition. It was the same expression she'd worn for months after Emma died. Lost, desperate, trying to figure out how to exist in a world that no longer made sense. How? His voice was barely a whisper. "Your hands," she said simply. "They're not the hands of someone who works construction or drives trucks for a living. And the way you sit, even when you're trying to slouch, you carry yourself like someone used to being in charge." He absorbed this, then asked the question she'd been dreading. "What do you want?" The assumption hit her like a physical blow. Of course he'd think she wanted something, money probably, or leverage. In his world, knowledge was currency, and she'd just revealed she held valuable information. "Nothing," she said, and watched surprise flicker across his features. "I don't want anything from you." "Then why?" "Because," Mia interrupted, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected. "You look like I felt for the first year after my daughter died. Like you're drowning and everyone around you thinks you're just swimming." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. In the background, the jukebox played an old country song about second chances, and someone laughed at the bar. But in their bubble, time had stopped. "Her name was Emma," Mia continued, her voice barely audible. "She'd be 8 now, and for the longest time after the accident, I felt like I was pretending to be alive while everything real inside me had died with her." Daniel's throat worked, but no words came. "I'm not trying to fix you," Mia said. "God knows I'm barely holding myself together. But I recognize someone who's lost, and I thought, maybe you didn't have to be lost alone." Daniel left Ruby's that night without finishing his ribs. He sat in his rental truck for 20 minutes in the parking lot, engine running, heat blasting against the October chill, staring at the folded napkin in his trembling hands. The words seemed to burn brighter each time he read them, like they were written in phosphorus instead of blue ink. "I know who you are. But more importantly, I know who you're trying to be." This was exactly what he'd been running from. The probing questions, the inevitable recognition, the moment when his carefully constructed escape collapsed around him. He should drive straight to the airport, fly back to Manhattan, and pretend these 3 weeks had never happened. Instead, he found himself thinking about the way Mia's voice had cracked when she mentioned her daughter. The raw honesty in her admission that she was barely holding herself together. No one had spoken to him like that in years, without agenda, without calculation, just human to human. But that was exactly the problem. Daniel Cross didn't do human connections. He did business relationships, strategic partnerships, mutually beneficial arrangements. Emotions were variables to be managed, not experienced. He built his empire by maintaining distance, by never letting anyone close enough to matter. And this waitress, this woman who saw too much and said too little, was threatening everything. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Rebecca, his assistant, with the text she sent every night at 9 p.m. Board meeting tomorrow at 8. Henderson merger documents need review. Jenkins from Tokyo called twice. The familiar weight of responsibility settled back on his shoulders like an old coat. This was who he was. This was what mattered. Not some misguided attempt at finding himself in roadside diners, pretending to be normal when normal had never been an option for him. He typed back, "Flying out tonight. Have car service meet me at Teterboro," but his finger hovered over the send button. Back inside Ruby's, Mia was failing spectacularly at pretending everything was normal. "You okay, honey?" Ruby emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a grease-stained apron. Ruby Martinez had owned this place for 15 years, and in that time, she developed an almost supernatural ability to read her employees' emotional states. "Fine," Mia lied, stacking plates with unnecessary force. And I'm the Queen of England." Ruby's dark eyes missed nothing. "This have anything to do with that fellow in booth 7? Saw him leave without finishing his food." Mia's hand stilled. "I might have made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "The kind where you reveal to a billionaire that you've figured out his identity and then have an emotional breakdown about your dead daughter," Mia thought. "The kind where you forget that some people's walls exist for good reasons. The kind where I stuck my nose where it doesn't belong." Ruby studied her for a long moment, then poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured toward the empty booth in the back. "Sit, talk." It wasn't really a request. Mia found herself spilling everything, her suspicions about Daniel, the note, the way he'd looked at her like she'd reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. Ruby listened without judgment, occasionally nodding, never interrupting. "So now I've probably scared him off forever," Mia concluded. "And maybe that's for the best. What was I thinking? Trying to connect with someone like that? We live in completely different worlds." "Do you?" Ruby asked quietly. "Ruby, the man could buy this entire town without breaking a sweat. I can barely make rent. Money's not the only thing that makes worlds different, Mia." Ruby's voice carried the weight of experience. Sometimes the richest people are the poorest when it comes to what actually matters. Mia stared into her coffee cup, seeing her reflection waver on the dark surface. "I told him about Emma." Good. Mia looked up, startled. "I basically trauma dumped on a complete stranger." "You shared something real with someone who's forgotten what real looks like. That's not trauma dumping, honey. That's courage." But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed a line. In the months after Emma's death, she'd become an expert at reading grief in others. The hollow look around the eyes, the careful way they held themselves, like sudden movements might shatter whatever was holding them together. Daniel had all the signs, but grief from what? And more importantly, what right did she have to force someone else to confront their pain just because she recognized it? The next morning, Daniel stood in the private jet that was supposed to take him back to his real life, phone pressed to his ear as Marcus droned on about quarterly projections. Through the small window, he could see the sun rising over the small town he'd been hiding in, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. "Sir, are you there?" "Yeah, I'm here." But he wasn't. Not really. Part of him was still in booth 7 at Ruby's, still staring at words written on a napkin by a woman who'd seen through 15 years of carefully constructed armor in 3 weeks. "The Henderson people are expecting an answer today," Marcus continued. "It's a good deal, sir. Clean acquisition, minimal regulatory hurdles. Postpone it." Silence on the other end. "Sir?" "I said postpone it. 24 hours." Daniel disconnected before Marcus could protest and called his pilot. "Change of plans. I'm staying another day." He told himself it was because loose ends needed to be tied up. He couldn't leave things hanging with someone who knew his identity. It was a security risk, a potential media nightmare. He needed to ensure her discretion, maybe arrange some form of compensation for her silence. But as he drove the rental truck back toward Ruby's for what he promised himself would be the last time, Daniel knew he was lying to himself. He wasn't going back to manage a crisis. He was going back because, for the first time in years, someone had looked at him and seen a person instead of a net worth. Someone had offered connection without condition, understanding without judgment. And despite every instinct screaming that emotional entanglements were dangerous, despite 15 years of success built on isolation and control, he couldn't quite bring himself to walk away from that, even if it scared the hell out of him, even if he had no idea what came next. The storm hit at 6:47 p.m., just as the dinner rush was winding down. Daniel had spent the day driving aimlessly through back roads, wrestling with the decision to return to Ruby's. He drafted and deleted a dozen text messages to Marcus, started toward the airport twice, and found himself parked outside the diner 3 separate times before losing his nerve and driving away. By evening, he'd accepted the truth he'd been avoiding. He was going back. Not because it was smart or logical, but because the alternative, flying back to New York without understanding what had happened between them, felt like abandoning something precious before he'd even figured out what it was. The first drops of rain splattered against his windshield as he pulled into Ruby's parking lot. By the time he reached the door, the sky had opened up with the kind of sudden violence that turned rural roads into rivers and made driving dangerous for anyone foolish enough to try. Inside, the dinner crowd was thinning as people hurried to beat the weather home. Daniel slid into his usual booth, hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered conversation. His hands were steady as he opened the menu he'd memorized weeks ago, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. When Mia appeared at his table, they both froze. She looked like she hadn't slept, dark circles under eyes that held a mixture of relief and wariness. Her hair was escaping its ponytail in damp tendrils, and there was a coffee stain on her uniform that suggested the day had been as rough for her as it had been for him. "You came back," she said quietly. "Apparently." Daniel's voice came out rougher than he intended, though I'm beginning to question my judgment. Something flickered across her face. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. "I can get someone else to take your table if you'd prefer." "No." The word came out sharper than he meant it to, urgent enough to make her pause. "I mean, no, please." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky like God rearranging furniture, and the lights flickered ominously. "The usual?" Mia's voice was carefully neutral, professional. "Actually." Daniel hesitated, then made a decision that surprised them both. "What would you recommend? Something that's not on the menu for people trying to be someone they're not." The question landed between them like a bridge neither had expected him to build. Mia's carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly, revealing something softer underneath. "Ruby's meatloaf," she said after a moment. "It's what she makes for family. Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans that she grows in the garden out back. Nothing fancy, nothing pretentious, just honest food." "Sounds perfect." As Mia walked away to place his order, the lights flickered again, more pronounced this time. Through the windows, Daniel could see the storm intensifying, rain coming down in sheets that turned the parking lot into a shallow lake. "Attention, folks," Ruby's voice carried from behind the counter, tinged with the kind of authority that came from years of managing crisis. "We've got flash flood warnings for the county. Roads are washing out, and the bridge on Route 9 is already underwater. Looks like y'all might be my guests for a while longer." A murmur went through the remaining customers, a mix of resignation and good-natured grumbling. Daniel felt something twist in his chest. Forced proximity. No escape route. No way to retreat to the safety of distance and anonymity. His phone buzzed. Marcus again, probably wondering where he was, why the Henderson meeting had been postponed indefinitely. Daniel turned it face down without reading the message. "Scary out there, huh?" Mia had returned with his coffee, but instead of rushing away to her other tables, she lingered. Maybe it was the storm, or the way the diner suddenly felt like a ship riding out rough seas, but the careful distance she'd maintained since yesterday seemed to be dissolving. "I've seen worse," Daniel lied. "Really? When?" The simple question caught him off guard. When was the last time he'd been in actual physical danger? When had he last faced anything more threatening than a hostile board meeting or a difficult acquisition? "Okay, no, I haven't," he admitted. "I live in a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman. The most dangerous weather I usually face is deciding whether to take an umbrella. Something in Mia's expression softened. Thank you. From what? For not lying. At least not about that. The words hung between them, acknowledgement of all the other lies, of omission, of identity, of purpose. Daniel found himself studying her face in the diner's fluorescent light, noting the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she was thinking, the small scar on her chin that spoke of childhood adventures. The note yesterday, he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. I shouldn't have. No, you should have. His interruption surprised them both. I've been thinking about it, about what you said, about drowning versus swimming. Thunder crashed overhead, close enough to rattle the windows. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in after a few seconds, bathing the diner in an amber glow that made everything feel intimate and uncertain. Ruby emerged from the kitchen with a handful of flashlights and the kind of calm competence that suggested she'd weathered storms before. Generator's acting up, she announced. But we've got battery backup for a few hours, and the gas stove still works. Coffee and comfort food, courtesy of Mother Nature's forced sleepover. Daniel looked around the diner, suddenly seeing it differently. What had felt like a hiding place for weeks now felt like a sanctuary. The handful of other stranded customers, an elderly couple, a trucker, a young mother with a toddler, were settling in with the resigned humor of people who'd learned to adapt. Mia slid into the booth across from him without asking permission, a flashlight casting dancing shadows between them. Guess you're stuck with us, she said. Guess I am. In the amber half-light, with the storm raging outside and nowhere to run, Daniel felt the last of his careful defenses begin to crumble. This wasn't the controlled environment where he made billion-dollar decisions. This was real life, messy and unpredictable, full of people who couldn't be managed or manipulated. And for the first time in years, instead of terrifying him, that felt like a relief. What do you think happens when we're forced to slow down and really connect with the people around us? Have you ever been stuck somewhere that turned out to be exactly where you needed to be? Let us know in the comments. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it had intensified, turning the world outside Ruby's into a wall of water and wind that made the diner feel like the last refuge on Earth. Mia had abandoned all pretense of working. With only 6 people stranded in the restaurant, including Ruby, there wasn't much to do except wait out nature's tantrum. She'd helped Ruby distribute blankets and pillows from the storage room upstairs. Apparently, the diner doubled as an unofficial shelter during weather emergencies, and now found herself sitting across from a billionaire in a booth lit by battery-powered lanterns, sharing the strangest conversation of her life. So you just left? Mia asked, wrapping her hands around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. No explanation to anyone? Daniel nodded, his face half hidden in shadows. In the amber light, without his usual careful composure, he looked younger, more vulnerable. I told my assistant I needed a few days to review the Henderson acquisition. 3 weeks later, she's still sending me increasingly frantic emails. What's the Henderson acquisition? A mid-sized manufacturing company, good profit margins, solid management, perfect for absorbing into our industrial division. He recited the facts like they belonged to someone else. It's exactly the kind of deal I've built my career on. But Daniel was quiet for so long that Mia thought he wouldn't answer. Outside, lightning illuminated the windows in stark white flashes, followed by thunder that shook the building's bones. But I was sitting in the boardroom 3 weeks ago, listening to the lawyers discuss the acquisition timeline, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. His voice was barely audible over the storm. Not metaphorically, actually couldn't breathe. My chest felt like someone was standing on it, and all I could think about was how many people would lose their jobs when we streamlined operations. Mia felt something shift inside her chest. How many? Henderson employs about 800 people. Small town in Ohio, family-owned for 3 generations. We'd probably keep maybe half. Daniel's hands clenched around his coffee mug. Financially, it makes perfect sense. Emotionally, it felt like murder. The words came out before Mia could stop them, raw and honest. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes finding hers in the lamplight. Yes, he said simply. Exactly like that. They sat in silence, the weight of shared understanding settling between them like a blanket. Around them, the diner had taken on the hushed quality of people settling in for a long night, quiet conversations, the rustle of blankets, Ruby humming softly as she cleaned glasses behind the counter. "Is that why you came here?" Mia asked. "To figure out what to do about Henderson?" "I came here to disappear," Daniel admitted. "To be someone who didn't have to make those kinds of decisions. Someone who could order ribs and worry about nothing more complicated than whether to tip 15 or 20%. "And how's that working out for you?" Daniel's laugh held no humor. "About as well as you'd expect. Turns out you can't run away from yourself, even if you drive 800 miles and buy a fake beard." "You had a fake beard?" Despite everything, Mia found herself smiling. "Lasted exactly one day, made me look like a discount lumberjack." Daniel's expression lightened slightly. "Though I kept the flannel. It's surprisingly comfortable." The moment of levity faded as another wave of rain lashed the windows. In the distance, they could hear the sound of rushing water, creeks overflowing their banks, turning roads into rivers. "Tell me about Emma," Daniel said quietly. Mia's hands stilled around her mug. She'd mentioned her daughter in the heat of emotion yesterday, but talking about Emma, really talking about her, was still like pressing on a wound that refused to heal. "She would have loved this," Mia said finally, gesturing toward the storm-darkened windows. "Emma was obsessed with weather. Used to sit by the window during thunderstorms and make up stories about what the clouds were arguing about." "What kind of stories?" "Oh, elaborate ones. The storm clouds were usually upset because someone had forgotten to water their garden, or because two cloud children were fighting over who got to rain on the parade." Mia's voice caught. She had this theory that rain was just the sky crying happy tears because it got to help things grow. Daniel didn't say anything, didn't offer platitudes or try to fix her pain. He just listened, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. "She was 6 when it happened," Mia continued. "We were driving home from her dance recital. She'd been so proud, had done this little tap routine to Singing in the Rain. She fell asleep in the back seat still wearing her costume, this sparkly blue dress with ribbons that she refused to take off." The memory was crystal clear, preserved in perfect detail. Emma's small face slack with sleep, her dance shoes still on her feet, the way the stage lights had caught the sequins on her dress during her performance. "The other driver ran a red light," Mia said, her voice steady but hollow. "Drunk, going 60 in a 30 zone. Emma never woke up." In the silence that followed, Mia could hear her own heartbeat, the storm outside, the quiet breathing of the man across from her. She told the story before, to doctors, to insurance adjusters, to the few friends who'd tried to help her through the aftermath. But she'd never told it like this, without the protective shell of clinical facts and legal details. "I used to think the worst part was the guilt," she said. "All the what-ifs. What if I'd left 5 minutes later? What if I'd taken a different route? What if I'd driven faster or slower or—" "But that wasn't the worst part," Daniel said softly. Mia looked up, startled by his understanding. "The worst part was realizing that all the money in the world, all the power, all the careful planning, none of it protects you from the things that actually matter." His voice was thick with emotion. "The worst part was learning that you're not actually in control of anything." "How do you—" Mia began, then stopped. "What happened to you?" Daniel was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I had a son." The words hit Mia like a physical blow. In all her research, in all the articles about the ruthless billionaire who'd built an empire through calculated acquisition and strategic brilliance, there had never been any mention of a child. "His name was Tyler," Daniel continued, staring into the darkness beyond the windows. "He would have been 12 this year." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the tears on Daniel's face that he'd stopped trying to hide. And suddenly, Mia understood everything. The running, the hiding, the desperate attempt to be someone else. The way he'd recognized her grief so completely. They weren't just two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were two parents who'd lost the most important thing in the world. Learning that survival meant finding a way to keep breathing, when breathing felt impossible. The confession hung between them like a bridge built from shared pain. Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, but inside their circle of lamplight, something fragile and precious was taking root. "Tell me about him," Mia said softly. Daniel's hands trembled as he set down his coffee mug. For 15 years, he'd buried Tyler's memory so deep that even thinking his son's name felt like excavating his own grave. But sitting here, with someone who understood the specific weight of parental grief, the words came easier than they had in over a decade. "He loved puzzles," Daniel began, his voice rough with emotion. "Not the kind you buy in stores. He made his own. Would draw these elaborate mazes and codes, then challenge me to solve them when I got home from work." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "He was smarter than me, even at 7. Had this way of seeing patterns that I never could." 7. Mia repeated, understanding flooding her features. "Leukemia. Diagnosed on a Tuesday, gone by Christmas." Daniel's voice cracked. "We had the best doctors money could buy, experimental treatments, second opinions from every specialist in the country. None of it mattered." The fluorescent emergency lights flickered, casting dancing shadows across their faces. Around them, the other stranded patrons had settled into the quiet rhythm of people waiting out nature's fury. Soft conversations, the rustle of blankets, the steady drum of rain against glass. "I threw myself into work after," Daniel continued. "Built Cross Industries into what it is today, because the alternative was sitting still long enough to feel what I'd lost. Every acquisition, every merger, every strategic decision, it was all just noise to drown out the silence where Tyler's voice used to be." Mia reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her fingers were warm, calloused from years of service work, real in a way that grounded him to the present moment. "Emma used to leave me notes," she said. "In my lunch bag, on the bathroom mirror, tucked into my nursing textbooks. Little drawings with messages like, 'Mama is the best,' or 'Have a super day.' I found one in my winter coat pocket 6 months after the accident, and I completely fell apart in the grocery store parking lot." "Do you still have them?" "Every single one." Mia's smile was watery but genuine. "They're in a shoebox under my bed. Sometimes, when the grief gets too heavy, I read them and pretend she just left for school and will be home any minute." Daniel squeezed her fingers gently. What was she going to be when she grew up? A veterinarian who was also a princess, who was also a scientist. Mia laughed, the sound bright against the storm's darkness. She had very ambitious career goals, said she wanted to cure sick animals and wear a tiara while doing experiments. Tyler wanted to be an inventor, had this notebook where he drew blueprints for machines that would solve world hunger and make pollution disappear. Daniel's voice grew stronger as he remembered. He said regular inventors only made things people wanted, but he was going to make things people needed. For a moment, the weight of their losses felt less crushing. In sharing their children's dreams, they brought Tyler and Emma into the lamplight with them, not as ghosts that haunted, but as memories that blessed. "I keep thinking about what you wrote in that note," Daniel said, "about who I want to become. The truth is, I have no idea. I've been Daniel Cross, CEO, for so long that I don't know who Daniel Cross, father, might have grown into." "Maybe that's okay," Mia said. "Maybe figuring it out is the point." Outside, a new sound joined the storm's symphony, the sharp crack of something large giving way. Through the rain-streaked windows, they could see the massive oak tree in the parking lot swaying dangerously, its roots loosened by the saturated ground. "That tree's been there longer than this building," Ruby called from behind the counter, worry evident in her voice. "If it goes down..." The lights went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, but dimmer this time, telling them the battery backup was struggling. Ruby appeared at their table with a more powerful flashlight, her face grim. "Generators completely dead, and the backup batteries won't last much longer," she said. "But that's not our biggest problem." Through the front windows, they could see water pooling in the parking lot, reflecting the occasional flash of lightning, like a black mirror. What had started as heavy rain was becoming something more dangerous. "Flash flooding," Ruby continued. "Drainage system can't handle this much water. We might be looking at more than just a power outage." As if summoned by her words, Harold, the elderly man who'd been playing cards with his wife in the corner booth, stood up unsteadily. "Margaret's not feeling well," he said, his voice tight with worry. "Her breathing's getting shallow, and she's complaining about chest pain." The small group fell silent. Margaret was in her 70s, clearly frail, and they were trapped in a diner with no power, rising water, and no way to call for emergency services. "I have some nursing training," Mia said, rising from the booth. "Not complete, but enough to help until—" "Until what?" Harold's voice cracked. "Look outside. Even if we could call an ambulance, how would they get here?" The reality of their situation hit them all at once. They weren't just waiting out a storm anymore. They were potentially facing a medical emergency with no communication, no transportation, and increasingly dangerous conditions outside. Daniel felt something familiar stir in his chest. Not the panic that had driven him from his boardroom 3 weeks ago, but something else. The part of him that had built an empire by solving impossible problems, by finding ways forward when others saw only obstacles. For the first time in 15 years, his wealth and power couldn't solve the problem. But maybe, just maybe, the man he'd been before he became a billionaire still could. "What do you need?" he asked Mia, standing beside her. She looked at him with surprise and something that might have been hope, help, and prayer that we can keep her stable until morning. Outside, the oak tree groaned ominously in the wind, and the water continued to rise. But inside their circle of lamplight, two broken people began to discover that sometimes the best way to heal yourself is to focus on healing someone else. Have you ever been in a situation where strangers became family during a crisis? Share your story in the comments about how challenging moments brought out the best in people around you. Margaret's condition deteriorated rapidly. What had started as shortness of breath became labored gasping, and her skin took on an alarming grayish pallor that made everyone in the diner exchange worried glances. Mia knelt beside the elderly woman, checking her pulse with fingers that trembled despite her attempts to project calm confidence. "Her heartbeat's irregular," Mia murmured to Daniel, who had positioned himself as her unofficial assistant. "Could be cardiac event, could be panic, could be a dozen other things, without proper equipment." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood the stakes. Harold hovered nearby, clutching his wife's hand with the desperate intensity of a man watching his world slip away. 47 years, he kept repeating. "We've been married 47 years. She can't, not like this." The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. Here he was, a man who could afford to buy the finest medical care in the world, watching helplessly as someone suffered from the one thing money couldn't fix. Timing. "We need to get her to a hospital," Harold said, his voice rising with panic. "Can't someone call?" "Phone lines are down," Ruby interrupted gently. "Cell towers too, most likely. And even if we could call, look outside." Through the rain-lashed windows, they could see that the parking lot was now completely flooded, water creeping steadily toward the diner's foundation. The oak tree swayed like a drunk dancer, its massive trunk groaning with each gust of wind. "There has to be something," Harold insisted, turning desperate eyes toward Daniel. "You've got money, right? Power? Can't you make some calls, pull some strings?" The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Even here, even in this moment of genuine human crisis, his identity as a billionaire reduced him to nothing more than a resource to be tapped. The connection he'd felt building with Mia, the fragile sense of being seen as a person rather than a bank account, cracked under the weight of Harold's assumption. "It doesn't work like that," Daniel said quietly. "Doesn't it?" Harold's grief was transforming into anger, the way it sometimes did when people needed someone to blame. "You sit there in your expensive clothes." "Harold, stop." Mia's voice cut through the rising tension. "He can't control the weather. None of us can." But the damage was done. Daniel could feel the walls rebuilding themselves, brick by brick. The careful distance he'd spent 15 years perfecting, the protective barrier that kept the world at arm's length. Harold saw him as Daniel Cross, billionaire. Soon, they all would. Soon, this moment of honest connection would be contaminated by expectations, assumptions, and the inevitable request for favors that came with his territory. Actually, Daniel heard himself saying, his voice taking on the clipped, professional tone he used in boardrooms, "There might be something I can do." Mia looked up sharply, something like warning in her eyes. "Daniel." He was already reaching for his phone, muscle memory overriding the voice in his head that screamed, this was a mistake. "I know people. Medical transport companies, emergency services." His fingers flew over the screen, pulling up contacts he hadn't called in weeks. "Even if the local infrastructure is compromised, I can." "No signal," Ruby said softly. Daniel stared at his phone's blank screen, the familiar weight of problem-solving momentum crashing into the wall of physical reality. No signal. No power. No way to leverage his wealth or connections or any of the tools he'd spent decades accumulating. He was just another person trapped in a diner, as helpless as everyone else. "I'm sorry," he said to Harold, the words feeling inadequate. "I'm sorry I can't." "Can't what?" Harold's voice was bitter now, sharp with grief and fear. "Can't buy your way out of this? Can't make the storm stop? What good is all that money if you can't save one old woman when it matters?" The accusation landed like a knife between Daniel's ribs. Because Harold was right, wasn't he? All those years of building power, accumulating wealth, convincing himself that success meant having solutions. And when it really mattered, when someone's life hung in the balance, he was as useless as anyone else. Worse than useless. He was a fraud. "That's not fair," Mia said, but Daniel was already pulling away, retreating into the familiar shell of isolation. "He's right," Daniel said, standing up abruptly. "I can't help. I can't save anyone." The words came out harder than he intended, weighted with 15 years of guilt and grief. Because this wasn't really about Margaret, was it? This was about Tyler, about all the money and power and desperate searching for the best doctors, the experimental treatments, the miracles that never came. This was about the fundamental truth that Daniel had been running from for half his adult life. He couldn't save the people who mattered most. "Daniel, don't." Mia reached for him, but he stepped back, the careful distance reasserting itself like a wall slamming down. "I should call someone," he said, knowing it was impossible but needing the familiar comfort of action, of doing rather than feeling. "There has to be. My assistant has contacts in emergency services, people who owe me favors." "Stop." Mia's voice was sharp now, cutting through his spiraling panic. "Just stop. This isn't about your money or your power or what you can buy. This is about being human." But that was exactly the problem. Daniel Cross, billionaire, knew how to solve problems. Daniel Cross, human being, was a disaster. Always had been. The kind of father who missed bedtime stories for board meetings, who thought love could be measured in the quality of Christmas presents and the prestige of private schools. The kind of man who let his son down when it mattered most. "I need some air," he said, already moving toward the door. "Daniel, you can't go out there," Ruby started. But he was already pushing through the door into the storm, into the wall of water and wind that felt less dangerous than staying in that circle of lamplight where people expected him to be something he'd never learned how to be. Behind him, through the rain-soaked windows, he could see Mia's face, illuminated by flashlight, her expression a mixture of hurt and understanding that somehow made everything worse. Because she'd seen who he really was. Not the billionaire, not the successful CEO, but the broken father who'd never figured out how to save anyone, especially himself. And now she knew, like everyone eventually did, that Daniel Cross was much better at running away than standing still. Even when running away meant leaving someone who might actually matter. What happens when our deepest fears about ourselves get triggered in moments of crisis? Have you ever pushed someone away just when you needed them most? Share your thoughts in the comments. Dawn broke with the kind of golden light that made the previous night's terror feel like a fever dream. The oak tree had missed the diner by perhaps 3 feet, its massive trunk now lying across the parking lot like a fallen giant. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling with possibility. Emergency crews had arrived at first light, along with paramedics who confirmed what Mia had suspected. Margaret had suffered a mild anxiety attack, not a heart attack, and would be fine with rest and observation. Daniel stood outside the diner, watching as Harold helped his wife into the ambulance, their hands intertwined with the fierce tenderness of people who'd been reminded that every moment together was a gift. "She's going to be okay," Mia said, appearing at his side with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Ruby had managed to get the gas stove working again, and the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the morning air. "Thanks to you." Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how natural it felt to have her close. No careful distance, no protective walls, just presence. "You saved her life." "We saved her life," Mia corrected gently. "All of us, together." The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Together. When was the last time Daniel had been part of a we that meant something beyond quarterly earnings and strategic partnerships? His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. Marcus, no doubt, probably wondering if Daniel had been swept away by the flood or finally suffered a complete breakdown. The outside world was calling him back. Board meetings, acquisitions, the carefully scheduled life of a man who'd forgotten how to live spontaneously. Daniel pulled out the phone, looked at the screen, and made a decision that would have shocked his shareholders. He turned it off. "Shouldn't you take that?" Mia asked, though her tone suggested she hoped he wouldn't. "Probably. The Henderson acquisition is supposed to close today. 800 jobs hanging in the balance. Millions of dollars in play." Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket. "But you know what? It can wait." "Can it? Really?" Daniel turned to look at her fully, this woman who'd crashed into his carefully ordered world like a force of nature. Her hair was escaping its ponytail in the morning humidity, there was a coffee stain on her uniform from the night's crisis, and she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "The night Tyler died," Daniel said quietly, "I was in Tokyo, closing a deal that couldn't wait. My ex-wife called 3 times before I finally answered. By the time I got home, he was gone, and I never got to say goodbye." Mia's hand found his, fingers intertwining with the same natural ease that had surprised them both in the storm's aftermath. "I've spent 15 years telling myself that business couldn't wait," Daniel continued. "That the next acquisition, the next merger, the next strategic decision was too important to delay. But I think I was just afraid that if I stopped moving long enough to feel anything real, I'd fall apart completely. And now?" Daniel looked around at the storm's aftermath, the fallen tree, the receding floodwater, the diner that had become an unexpected sanctuary. "Now I think maybe falling apart isn't the worst thing that could happen. Maybe it's just making room for something better to grow." Through the diner's windows, they could see Ruby bustling around the kitchen, already preparing for the lunch crowd despite the night's drama. The young mother and her toddler were sharing pancakes in a corner booth, the child chattering excitedly about the big storm adventure. Life was reasserting itself with the resilient determination that Daniel had forgotten existed outside corporate boardrooms. "I have a confession," Mia said suddenly. "I looked you up, after I figured out who you were. Read all the articles about the ruthless billionaire who never gives interviews, never attends charity galas, doesn't have any known personal relationships." Daniel felt the familiar tension creep back into his shoulders. And I couldn't understand how someone who gives millions to children's hospitals, anonymously thinking no one would notice, could be described as heartless. Mia's voice was soft but sure. "It took me a while to realize you weren't heartless, you were heartbroken." The words hit him like absolution, like permission to be human in a way he'd forgotten was possible. "The Henderson deal," Daniel said suddenly. "What if instead of acquiring them, we partnered with them? Help them expand, modernize, grow their workforce instead of cutting it? Would that work? Financially, it's riskier, less immediate profit, more complex logistics." Daniel felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Excitement about a business decision that put people before profits. But it might work. It might actually work better in the long run. And if it doesn't? Daniel smiled, the expression feeling more natural than it had in years. "Then I'll figure something else out. I'm good at solving problems when they actually matter." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the world wake up around them. In the distance, Daniel could see news vans arriving, Small-town storms made good human interest stories, and soon reporters would be interviewing Ruby about her diner that doubled as a community shelter. "I should probably get back to New York," Daniel said, though the words felt wrong in his mouth. "Should you? I have a company to run. People depending on me." But even as he said it, Daniel was thinking about the note Mia had written, about the man he'd been trying to become versus the man he wanted to become. "What if you ran it from somewhere else for a while?" Mia asked. "I mean, you disappeared for 3 weeks and the world didn't end. Maybe it could handle you being human for a little longer." Daniel stared at her, understanding flooding through him like sunrise. "Are you asking me to stay?" "I'm asking you to choose," Mia said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "The same choice you made last night when you ran toward danger instead of away from it. Choose connection over isolation. Choose being real over being safe. And if I choose to stay, what then? Then we figure it out, together." Mia's smile was brighter than the morning sun. "Fair warning, though. I work crazy hours, I'm still figuring out how to live with grief, and I've got absolutely no idea how to date a billionaire. Good thing I have no idea how to date anyone," Daniel said, stepping closer. "Maybe we can figure it out together." "Together," Mia agreed, and when she kissed him, it tasted like coffee and possibilities and the kind of love that comes after you've stopped looking for it. In the distance, Daniel's phone began buzzing again, but for the first time in 15 years, he didn't care. The business world could wait. The acquisition could wait. Everything could wait while he learned how to be human again. One cup of coffee at a time, with a woman who'd seen his worst and chosen to love his best. 6 months later, the Henderson Manufacturing Company announced its most successful quarter in company history, thanks to an innovative partnership with Cross Industries that had created 300 new jobs instead of cutting 800. The deal made headlines in business journals as a revolutionary approach to corporate expansion, putting people and sustainability ahead of pure profit margins. Daniel Cross reached for comment at a small diner in rural Virginia, where he'd been spending increasing amounts of time, simply smiled and said, "Sometimes the best acquisitions aren't about taking over someone else's business. Sometimes they're about building something better together." And when the reporter asked about his unexpected engagement to a local waitress, Daniel's answer was even simpler. "She handed me a note that stopped me cold. Best business advice I ever received." What note would you write to someone who needed to remember their humanity? Share in the comments about a time when love found you exactly when you stopped looking for it, and tag someone who reminds you that the best things in life can't be bought, only chosen.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you loved this story, you will definitely love the next one. It's more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So go ahead and watch it now. Click on the image on your screen right away to watch the next one. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. It helps and encourages us to share the best human interest stories you'd love.